Hello, everybody, and welcome to another book review. This time, Stephen King's Dead Zone, which has a copyright by the author of 1979. Um, in its German version, unabridged, it's got 556 pages. And it tells the story of Johnny Smith, no second name, no middle name. And we follow this man from a day in his early childhood when he goes ice skating and he basically has an accident and hits his head. And for just a very, very short moment in time, he is unconscious and he has like something going on in his mind, and he wakes up um, in the surrounded by the people who have watched him uh, collide with the other ice skater or ice hockey player. Actually, it's kind of like a frozen pond, and there are people there, and they all know him. And he wakes up and he says, "Don't bypass." And nobody really knows what he's saying and what this means. And then we find out a couple of days later, another person who was at that pond, at that lake, basically had an empty battery in his car, and he wanted to jumpstart the car using the battery of another, and then basically decides to bypass something or other in that particular battery and then kills himself in the process. So if he hadn't bypassed whatever it is that he bypassed, he would have survived. The thing about this whole accident is that he just has a bump, so basically he's got like a little bump on his head, and his parents are not really aware of it, and he doesn't tell anyone, and basically nobody really talks about this. And he grows up and he goes to school, he goes to college, he becomes a teacher, he falls in love with another teacher named Sarah. The two of them begin dating, and it's a really lovely relationship the two of them have, until one day he invites her to go to a fair, to a country fair. And the two of them do, and they basically go to a couple of rides, and then there's a kind of roulette type Wheel of Fortune thing where you basically place bets on even and odd or colors or actual numbers. And then the guy spins the wheel, and then if your number hits or if it's even and you put it on even, your money on even, then you win. It's like a little bit like roulette in a casino. And he starts placing bets, and suddenly he falls into this trance-like fugue state, and he changes a little. His eyes become kind of purple, and he gets this dispassionate look on his face. His girlfriend is starting to feel really bad. She's starting to feel queasy, feels like she needs to vomit. And he keeps placing bets, and other people are coming as well and placing bets. And they're all winning because he's able to predict the future. He doesn't say so, but he basically just knows how to place his bets. And this goes on for a good while, and he wins $540. And it's all set in the early 1970s. I want to say this is probably 1970, 1971. And finally, the two of them go home. She feels terrible and decides to stay at home even the next day. And he says, "It's fine. I'm going to go into school and I'm going to excuse you, say that you have a medical issue." And he calls a taxi, gets in the cab, and asks the taxi to drive him home. And then there's a car accident. The cabby driver dies. He's uh, thrown out of the car, hits his head, and falls into a coma for the next 5 years. During those 5 years, his mother, who's already kind of like a little bit of a religious fanatic, goes completely insane. She starts writing letters to snake handlers in the deep south. To get like, blessed pieces of cloth that she can put on his wrist and things like that. She starts believing in UFOs and in angels, and kind of like all of these really weird ideas blossom in her heart. She starts subscribing to various brochures and magazines about all kinds of extraterrestrial, meet Jesus, meet God, meet whatever. And she even goes to a farm somewhere in the middle of nowhere to wait for the end of days, which then doesn't come, so she comes back home. And she always believes that God will bring back her son Johnny from the coma because he's got a plan for him. And at some point, Johnny actually does wake up. So he's got a long ride ahead of him with regard to regaining his bodily abilities. They find out really quickly that his mind is still fine, but he also realizes that he can predict the future. And not only that, he has premonitions, but also postmonitions. So, for example, he touches his neurologist's hand and finds out that the neurologist was born in Poland, and his mother vanished. But it's actually not true. His mother didn't die when the Nazis invaded Poland, but she lost her memory in an accident during the invasion, and then woke up and moved to Switzerland, fell in love with some architect. The two of them got married. They both moved to the United States, had 4 children, one of whom died in Vietnam, and she's now living happily ever after in Carmel in California, whereas her son also left Europe after, or maybe during the Second World War, and became a neurologist on the Eastern Seaboard. And they've been living in the same country on the same continent at opposite ends, but didn't know that the other one was still alive. And he basically informs his neurologist of this, and the neurologist rings the woman. He doesn't talk to her, he hangs up, but basically he confirms that this woman is real. So that's one instance where he basically starts to predict stuff, and people are getting kind of like anxious about this because that's terrible. And I can understand that. I mean, you don't want to be touched by somebody who can basically know all about you. He also predicts that his mother will die unless she starts taking blood pressure medicine, which she does, but then after a while she stops and he can't make her take it again, so she basically later on dies of a stroke. All the while thinking that he's meant for higher things. He also finds out that his girlfriend has in the meantime married and she's got a son, so they kind of reconnect once. They also have some casual sex later in the story. And basically, then he also touches other people. So he finds out that his physiotherapist's house is burning down and will be completely destroyed unless they call the fire engine now, and they do, and everything is fine. But again, there's kind of like, oh my God, nobody wants to touch him now. And then there's a whole press conference thing going where one of the journalists basically taunts him and says, "You're a fraud." And then he says, "Well, I want you to prove it." And he's like, "No, no, I'm not going to prove anything." It's like, "Yeah, well, you're a fraud, blah, blah, blah." And then he ends up proving it and finds out terrible things about the journalist's sister and tells him about it. And then the journalist is all huffy puffy and kind of like, "I'm going to destroy it." And he writes really nasty things about him. Then there's this kind of like wacko journal inside view or whatever it's called. And this guy comes to his house and says, "Well, I want to take a picture of you, and we're going to have ghostwriters create 12 columns per year, so one for each month, where we make up predictions and you just lend us your name and your face, and we're going to pay you for it." And people will start sending you stuff. And all this time he has been receiving letters with stuff from people: "Touch this because my husband is unfaithful, I want to know who the bitch is," and things like that. Or, "My brother is missing," and he basically touches the thing of this brother and he finds out that he died in quicksand. But he's not going to tell the sister because he feels that the sister might not take it kindly if he tells her that her brother died screaming and all alone and was in total panic and really felt every single second of his death. So all of this serves one purpose. We really find out that this guy has supernatural abilities, and they are probably brought on by his multiple head injuries. There is then, like I said, this inside view guy, and he says, "Well, we're going to pay you, and you're going to get people writing stuff to you, sending you stuff. You can keep all of that. They will send you money. You can keep all of this." And he cites other so-called clairvoyants that work for them that are making huge amounts of money, and they go to television stuff, and he's like, "We can make you rich." And he's like, "I'm not interested." He literally kicks him out of the house, and I mean literally kicks him out of the house. And then this guy says, "Oh, I'm not finished with you. We're going to write an article about you, and we will, they will throw you out of the village." Well, they don't throw him out of the village, but the article does get published. But he doesn't care because he thinks he's got a teaching job back at his old school. However, his old school basically then retracts the signed contract against the will of the principal, but the school board decides that they don't want him there after all because he's kind of like a weirdo. And so he ends up with nothing, but then he gets hired by some guy who's very rich and who's got a son who's an athlete, jock, and he has problems reading. But he manages to overcome this using a particular methodology, and then, the child, or it's a young boy, he's like, or a teenager even, and he actually manages to bypass this blockage that this guy has in his head, and it goes really well. And basically during that time, a person named Greg Stilson, who we meet very early in the novel. He's the one who kills the dog, and he's a rainmaker at the time, and kind of like a religious type person traveling through the South, I think, and basically kills a dog in the meantime as well. So the dog dies, again, Stephen King. Um, and basically every so often we see little snippets of what he does. Basically, he gets um, biker rockers to work for him. He uses intimidation. He becomes the mayor of a town somewhere, and he wants to be elected to, I want to say, the Senate for New Hampshire. Anyways, and so basically this we see snippets of this guy every so often. Then another very important turning point is that there is a 5-year span during which a murderer kills women of all ages, aged 9 to, I don't know, 60. He rapes them terribly, and while he's raping them, he strangulates them, so they die from suffocation, essentially. And one day, the Sheriff Bannerman of Castle Rock, and again, here we have the Stephen King multiverse reference, comes and says, "Help me! I need you to help me." He's like, "No, I don't want to." And then he persuades him, and he does, and he goes there and he checks out the crime scene. It's a really interesting part of the book, really riveting. It's very well written, and he finds out it's actually the deputy sheriff. And he tells the sheriff, but the sheriff says, "No, that's not true." And he treats him like a son, and he really loves this guy, like, and then John Smith says, "Well, it's him. That's the only thing I can tell you." And then basically the sheriff beats him up slightly, and then finally relents, and then they go to the house of the deputy sheriff, but the deputy sheriff has already committed suicide and put a piece of paper around his neck saying, "I confess," or "I did it," or something. And they find out that the sheriff's that this guy's mother knew all along. He's kind of like this really unhealthy relationship with his mother, which is also explained in the book. So there's some sexual abuse on her part, and and well, he's a sexual predator, but he was made into that by his sexually deviant mother, or sexually oppressive mother, whatever you want to call it. Um, and then that story ends. Um, and then he basically later in life meets this Greg Stilson at a rally, shakes his hand, and basically kind of feels that something terrible is going to happen. He also meets Jimmy Carter and shakes his hand and says, "You're going to be the president," which of course is true. Jimmy Carter did become president of the United States. So it's this, he feels really uneasy about this, and he starts thinking about it, and then and that's when I started skipping pieces of the book, because I have to say one thing at this stage: the book is terribly bloated. This should have been edited by someone, and they could have cut out 100 pages easily. Um, it's way too much, and it does have so many lengths in there where you're kind of like, yeah, I do get that this guy has supernatural powers. We don't have to have yet another incidence of it. I understand it. I understood it the first time, second time made it a little clearer, third time, yeah, but that's it. I don't need a fourth, fifth, sixth time. So it goes on and on. So I started skipping, but bits and pieces in there. Um, Johnny says, if to someone, if you knew what Hitler was going to do, and if you could travel back in time, would you kill him? And this guy's like, no, I would actually join the party and try to change it from within. Interesting concept. Um, and then it kind of ends with Johnny deciding to shoot Greg Stilson at a rally. And then the last couple of pages focus on him actually going in there trying to shoot him. He fails. He is shot himself. He dies. And he then goes to the light or into the light. Actually, it's a dark corridor that you go into if you die in this book. And basically, it turns out that he's had a brain tumor all along, which basically created this kind of dead zone in his brain, which made it possible for him to have premonitions, postmonitions, whatever you want to call it. And he would have died anyway at some point. So in 1979, he then decides to kill Greg Stilson because he kind of foresees that Greg Stilson will become the president of the United States and will uh, create an atomic he will launch atomic bombs somewhere in South Africa for some reason, and there will be a global nuclear war. Um, but he fails in his endeavors, and of course, that's it. That's the story. And it's an interesting story for very many reasons. This idea of somebody being able to predict the future or to know things about people, even about the past of those people, that's really interesting. It's picked up later by Anne Rice in her Witching trilogy, where in the first, I don't know if he's also in the second and third books, but in the first book, you've got this guy who basically has a near-death experience in the sea near San Francisco, and then since that time, everything he touches basically tells him something about either the person or whatever the object is that he's touching. It's terrible because he can't shut it out. So it's different for Johnny Smith. It doesn't happen all the time, and he can have a normal life. And then the question again, if you know that something terrible is going to happen linked to a person, will you kill that person? And Stephen King, explores this a lot later in the book 221163, where the protagonist finds a way to travel back in time, and he realizes he could stop the whole Kennedy assassination, but he doesn't travel back to 63, but he travels back to, I believe, 58. And he starts living in that area and trying to understand what's happening. So it's more like experiencing the lead up to the Kennedy assassination, and then decides to, or well, thinks about what he's going to do. I haven't read it, but this is basically the premise. So this is a topic that Stephen King picks up later as well. It's also a very political book. So it's set in the 70s, and it's set against the backdrop of Vietnam, of Lyndon B. Johnson. You've got this guy who's been in a coma for 5 years. So he wakes up and suddenly Richard Nixon is gone. He's like, and then in a conversation, somebody says, yeah, Watergate. And he's like, what's Watergate? What's a Watergate? And they're like, well, it's a hotel, and, Cubans broke into a hotel room, blah, blah, blah. Um, and and King talks about the changes in society, and the hair on the heads of the men grows longer, and people are suddenly waking up. The students are waking up at the universities and start protesting and things like that. Um, so, and it is to do with this guy who basically is a terrible person and a very violent person and tries to come to power. And that's, of course, a very interesting premise, and a lot could have been made with this. But I think he couldn't decide if he wanted it to be a supernatural book or a political book. And then he threw this crime story in with this guy, with this murderer in Castle Rock, which leads nowhere. And then he also has this inside view guy who basically destroys Johnny's reputation in amongst the people who believe. Um, that could have led to something, that basically he then realizes that he knows something about Greg Stilson and tries to appeal to people and tries to say, well, I've seen it. But the fact that he basically has fallen out with the community that reads Inside View, and apparently they've got 3 million readers or something, means that nobody's believing him now. Or he could have tried to patch things up with inside view and said, well, I know I treated you badly back then, I threw you out, but actually I've got this scoop on this guy and he's a terrible person, we need to do something about it. But all of this leads nowhere. While I do understand the inside view part of the book because it shows Johnny is not going to be bought. He knows he's got this ability, but he's not going to use it to make money. And he also thinks that the way the guys from Inside View are doing it is terrible because they're basically taking people for a ride. He's not going to write his own columns. He's not going to write about the prediction he is going to make, but they're just going to make it up anyway and regardless. And it's going to be BS at the end of the day. That would have told us something about it, but it also means we could have left out this whole story with the murderer because it leads nowhere. It's in and of itself a very interesting police procedural snippet, you know. It would have made for a nice short story, but in this book, it's completely out of place and it doesn't do anything. I mean, I thought it was like 50 pages or so, 50 very entertaining pages, a lot more entertaining than most of this book because the book is actually quite boring, but it just felt misplaced. So I don't know if this was edited by anyone, because in 1979, King was, well, he had already published Salem's Lot and Carrie. Carrie had already been turned into a movie. Um, but I think he was still not so well known and such a great in his own right that his books would have gone unedited. Because, like somebody said, it has like the scene which should have been edited out. People should have said, Stephen, you are on drugs. We know this. This is wrong. Take it out. But also the book apparently is quite bloated. And there are certain things that could have been edited out without destroying the story or the pacing. It would have increased the pacing, made it better. So Dead Zone is an interesting concept. Um, Maybe even the first book to explore it, but it wants too much. It wants to be political. It wants to describe the sign of the times, as it were, because it was published in 79. So he probably wrote it in 77 to 78, or maybe even earlier than that, or maybe starting to conceptualize it earlier than that. So he is catching the vibe of the time in a way and exploring that. But you have to make up your mind. What are you going to write? Are you going to write a supernatural story, which this is? Are you going to write a crime story, which there are some parts in it? Are you going to write a political commentary, like, for example, the book Running Mate, um, which is a really good political book, um, which basically comments on the Clinton era. But it's like he had these ideas and he just chucked all of them in and nobody had the will to stand up and say, take out this whole mass murderer or this whole serial killer thing, because it starts early in the book and you get snippets and then you get the whole section on it. You could have left this out easily. And also these endless discussions, or where we see, how he rehabilitates himself. Then there's the story that his father, after his mother's death, at some point it's like, oh, I'm marrying again. Are you okay with this? And then they have like this, he gets married and there's a wedding and so on. I'm like, that's great. And Johnny is happy for his father, but it doesn't do anything for the book. It doesn't further the story and it just basically doesn't help. Um, And I think here King overestimated his ability to create characters, because he's very good at creating characters, but you don't need an exhaustive B-roll of storytelling to make those characters available to the reader. It would have, I mean, the fact that he explains how Vera, Johnny's mother, falls more and more into this religious fanaticism, and she ends up following those UFO people into the wilderness where they have like this rundown farm that they've bought to wait for the end of days, and then she comes back. These are all snippets, and they are short and they are quick, and they make the story move forward. But this whole thing about his father marrying, even this whole story about this Chuck guy who he's teaching, that could have been like, he does this, you see a couple of things, how he's successful. So this means that his dad is really happy about this. And the two of them start talking about Greg Stilson, and he tells him a couple of things about Greg Stilson, how Greg Stilson is into real estate and a crook and blah, blah, blah. That would have been interesting because it would have furthered the story. But you don't need to then talk about Chuck and having another girlfriend and this one she reads and stuff and blah, blah, blah. There was just too much. And then the two of them go skiing and have another conversation about killing Hitler. That would have been more important. Yeah, but you could have left out the skiing part and how they then decide to have a Chivas Regal. It just was overindulgent in my opinion. So I cannot really recommend it. I doubt I'll ever read it again. But I'm trying to read every Stephen King book that isn't It or Carrie because I don't want to read these two. I did read It to page 800 or something. So I can say I've read it, but only in parts. I skipped as of page 390. I started skipping, which is something I don't really do usually, but I just couldn't for the life of me keep reading. But I've read the last pages and it ends, and it's kind of like, okay, so what now? Because Greg Stilson is dead. It isn't dead. Johnny is. We don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we know now because it's now 2023. There is no president called Greg Stilson, but we don't know what happens in Stephen King's multiverse. Did he become president? In Stephen King's world, was there an atomic war? We will never know. So, of all of the books I've read by Stephen King so far, and I've read, it's now the 5th of December, and I started reading Stephen King, I want to say, in the first week of November of 2023. I've read The Body, The Mist, Gunslinger, The Drawing of the Three, Dead Zone, and I think another one as well. Was it only 5 books? Well, I mean, 5 books is very good for 4 weeks. So I was going to wait for the Dark Tower series review until I'd read every single one, but I've now decided not to do it because, of course, the books weren't published at the same time. It was a series that was published over several decades, actually. And I've read the first two, and I've read the Gunslinger in its original version, not the revised one. So I'm going to do the Gunslinger and the Drawing of the Three in one. Because if I had started reading them back then, I would have also had to wait for stuff to be finished because it took him a very long time to complete it. And he nearly died during that process because he had a car accident. So I'm actually going to do this possibly this weekend. I don't know, maybe Sunday, we'll see. And then I'm going to give Stephen King a break. And I'm going to continue with something completely different. And until such time as we speak again, have a lovely rest of the day. Bye.